they're a vitamin. They're not a medicine. You need great HR. You need to be able to hire extraordinarily well. How would you even know if you were successful? The reality is simpler is better.
All right, so welcome everyone to our next conversation as part of the Agile Insights Conversation series. We are today being joined by Christina Wodtke. I'm very excited because I read her book, Radical Focus. This is now here, the second edition. And Christina and I will talk about several things. Now, before we get to introducing Christina or giving her the stage to introduce herself, let me share a bit of the intention of this interview, of this conversation with you. My intention is to try to focus on topics that have not been covered in other interviews already, because Christina has done a few interviews, especially last year when the second edition of the book was launched. One of the interviews was with the folks at Why Matters, which I liked a lot. And we will link that interview in our show notes so that I try to avoid having a lot of redundancy. And the topics that I want to get through are the following. So first of all, getting to know Christina. Second, getting to hear her definition of OKRs and why she is so passionate about this topic. I mean, she's written not only one, but a second edition of a book around this topic. I want to know about the prerequisites that are required in organizations to implement OKRs, because I do see a lot of organizations, clients of ours, but also others, aiming to introduce OKRs, and they are facing a lot of difficulties. And I also want to talk about the role of leadership. And finally, I want to talk about the concept of a learning organization. Because when I listen to your interviews, Christina, when I read your book, this concept of the learning organization is again and again and again coming up, right? But a lot of people do not associate a topic like OKRs with the learning organization, but you do. And I find this very insightful. So without further ado, let's get to it. And I'd like to give you, Christina, first of all, a very warm welcome and a big thank you for joining us here. I know it's early on where you're based, and we really appreciate you being here. I'd like to give you the stage to quickly introduce yourself so that the people in our audience who don't know you yet get a good feeling about who you are and what your journey has been so far, because it's quite interesting and remarkable.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me on your podcast. It's quite the honor. Agile has been such an important part of my career, and it's great to reach out to people who care about it as much as I do and you do. Right now I'm coming to you from my office at Stanford. So I am a lecturer in human-computer interaction. I focus mostly on how can we make technology much more humane, which is something I care about. In fact, the reason I write about OKRs and the team that managed itself is because I also want business to be humane. Now, all of this stuff we're building is for human beings. So why is it not, supporting us and caring for us in the way we should be? So that's something I really feel like I'm on a mission to change very profoundly. So I teach a bunch of different classes. And as well as that, in the fall, I'm going to start a human-centered product management class just to talk about how can we consider not just the human beings we serve, which is so incredibly important, our customers, but also the human beings we work with. So that's where I am right now. And then, of course, I've done, every time I list off everything I've done, it's kind of long. So I've worked at a bunch of companies like Zynga, MySpace, Yahoo, LinkedIn, of course, e-greetings back in the day. I also started a couple companies, social good companies. And I just found my way over to teaching, and I really love it now. It's a great time. I mean, when I work with my students, they're always like, I have to have the perfect first job. And I'm like, no, you really don't. You can have so many different lives and so many different adventures if you just follow your nose and do the things that matter to you.
Yeah, if you just follow your nose. And I think if you also put in the work at every single new journey or step that you take. Similar to you, I've done a lot of different things, started out as a medical doctor, the management consultant, and then going into the entrepreneurial path. So I can very much relate to the journey that you've had. And maybe at some point, I also end up at one of the better business schools in the world and teach, because this is my true passion as well. So Christina, thank you for this quick introduction. Now, a lot of the work that you've done, both at the companies that you've listed, for example, Zynga, which I think was one of the remarkable companies of its time, and where you also had your first interaction with OKRs, if I'm not mistaken, and many other companies, but also especially in your books, your work has been based around this framework, around this topic of OKRs. Would you mind sharing briefly with our audience what OKRs are and why you are so passionate about this? And maybe you can also make the link to what you just mentioned, human interaction.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Unfortunately, I feel like a lot of people who've picked up OKRs seem to think of it as another way to get more productivity out of people. And if you're constantly struggling for more productivity, you're treating humans like machines. Like, if I can just tune this up, add a little more memory, whatever. But that's not how humans work. So the way I learned OKRs at Zynga, and of course, Zynga was a John Doerr company. So John Doerr introduced it to Mark Pincus, who was CEO at the time. He's been CEO on and off. So I don't know if he is right now, but he was the founder. And in particular, I think it was Cityville who really took OKRs into a strong art form, very simple, high line. But it was always about what are we not doing that we have to do. So Zynga was a very, very opportunistic company. If you may remember, it was notorious for jumping on fads or taking advantage of certain trends, and it was good at that. But the problem is, when you're a very opportunistic company, how do you deal with strategy? So that's how they dealt with strategy, is to make sure they were choosing things that were incredibly important to them. Then when I left Zynga, people, didn't know what to do. So I ended up consulting with some startups, simplifying the approach to OKRs. But the big thing that really happened for me is when I left Zynga, I didn't know what to do. And I was like, okay, I'm tired, I'm burnt out, I don't know what direction to take my life. And I thought, well, let's use OKRs to sort my life out. So I started setting some early OKRs about, have a job that makes me enough money to live, but makes me happy. And what does well-being look like? And these are really important questions, like, what are the signs when I'm not healthy? Is it stomach upset? Is it back pain? And being able to track that made me learn a lot about what I should do with my life. And I have to say it's worked, because I've never been happier in my life. This job is an amazing one.
Yeah. So you've seen it applied at a startup or scale up such as Zynga. You've applied it to your own life. And if I'm not mistaken, in your past work, you've also helped a lot of larger organizations, more established organizations, implement OKRs, sometimes successfully and sometimes less successfully. Now, when we talk about OKRs, and for those who don't know what OKRs stand for, it's objectives and key results. And I always refer to them as, the objective is the future that we want to see. Mm-hmm. And the key results are basically indicators of whether we've got there or not, right?
Couldn't put it better myself.
Pardon?
Could not put it better myself.
Yeah, I learned from reading your book. So, and now what I always see, that organizations that have issues at many places, right? They're not necessarily agile, which usually also means that they struggle with innovating all sorts of innovation, be it product or business model innovation, whatever, that they think that OKRs can be a quick fix to a lot of their problems. And what I found particularly interesting, looking at your work, and it actually starts, I think, with a blog post you wrote in 2014, "The Art of OKRs," and you've written, or you've done a redo of that blog post in 2021, I guess. And even then, in that short blog post, you already name some of the prerequisites of OKRs. But I believe that too few people have put in the work before implementing OKRs to read even that blog post, let alone this book. And I want to share a quote out of this book and then use that as a trigger for a conversation with you. And that quote is not even from you. It's in the foreword from Marty Kagan. And it's the following: "Unfortunately, what too many people don't realize is that this particular technique," referring to OKRs, "depends on a culture of empowerment. Mm-hmm. It emerged from companies that already had this culture of empowerment." And when I hear you speak also in other podcasts, you emphasize this a lot, that empowerment is a prerequisite. And I would like to dive into this topic with you. First of all, understand how you define empowerment, to what extent empowerment needs to be in place before we can get started with OKRs, and also to what extent OKRs can help us to get to a culture of more empowerment?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say OKRs are a fix for getting empowerment. And I don't think they're a fix. I don't think they're a fix for a lot of things except maybe the shiny object syndrome. But I would say they're how I have this wonderful friend, Ed Batista, and he always says, they're a vitamin. They're not a medicine, So what you want to do is get the company healthy first, and then OKRs can make you even healthier and stronger and better. So I always think that prerequisites. Oh my gosh. I feel like you should be agile, you should be lean, and you should probably look at Alex Osterwalder's work around business models, just because there's a new way of working. And this new way of working has been noticed by Marty, of course, and several others, including Jeff Patton. And I've started referring to it as nimble. These are people who are working lean, working agile. They're constantly have an endless cycle with their customers, using continuous discovery. And those are the people that OKRs work really well about. But to have this a nimble kind of team, then what are you going to do? You have to have the ability to let them chase things down. You can't micromanage them. As a CEO or a general manager, you just cannot micromanage them. So you have to empower them. And this is when the OKRs are really useful because of the way OKRs are set. They don't tell you what to build. They just say, this is the result I would like. And so you hand it to your nimble team and say, okay, we're going to check in later and let me know what's going on. And that person who's setting it up, the boss, they can check in every week in the Monday check-ins, or they can check in every 2 weeks or whatever. It doesn't matter, because if you've hired well and your team is working really well, they'll just take this promise and make things happen for you. And that really is the dream, because you cannot scale your company if you can't scale yourself. And the only way to scale yourself is to be able to trust your teams and trust your managers, right? So, and part of that really is about psychological safety, because if you hand these people OKRs and they're constantly saying, should we do this? Should we do this? That means they're scared. They're afraid if they make a bad choice, then they're going to be fired, right? Or they're going to lose a bonus. And that means you haven't done the work to say, I really do trust you. Let me show you, by turning things around. And I work a lot with C-level folks saying, how can we shift your conversation with people to being more along the lines of, should we do this? And then you can say, well, what do you think? What are the pros and cons? And just listen to them. And then let them talk their way into an answer. And then you just go, okay, that sounds good. Let me know how it goes. This constant giving away of power and taking away the punitive parts of management is just, that's the only way people are going to be comfortable doing anything. And that will set your smartest, most amazing employees on fire. They'll get so excited. It's like their baby, this thing they're making happen. And that's what you want. You want motivation. You want the carrot, not the stick.
Yeah. So what I like about the sequence that you've just walked us through is you've connected so many of the topics that I have had the pleasure of talking to people about it, like Marty's work around empowerment and leadership and coaching, Teresa Torres' work around product discovery, right? Jeff Patton's work around product management or product ownership in general. A lot of these things, and psychological safety as an additional concept, and you've tied all of that together, basically stating that if you don't have all of these, OKRs are not going to be a fix for the problems that you're seeing in the organization. And I love that analogy, of course, being a medical doctor, of OKRs being a vitamin and not a medicine. I will never forget that one, which is great. Now, help me understand one thing. When you say that these things are prerequisites to some extent, empowerment and discovery and agility and being nimble, as you mentioned, what would you recommend to organizations, especially larger organizations, right, that do not have a culture of empowerment, a culture of innovation, a culture of whatever, like great leadership? When they approach you and say, hey, Christina, you've written this excellent book, right? We want OKRs. What do you do with them?
I think we have conversations to start with. And I'm sure that's where we start. We ask questions. I want to know more about why do they want OKRs? What are they hoping to get from it? What are they struggling with right now? What is their industry? Is it even an industry that can be nimble, right? So it's really important to understand yourself, your company culture, your company psychology, because OKRs aren't really for everybody. Sometimes it's better just to have some KPIs that you're monitoring and move more slowly. At which point I might say, it's possible OKRs only belong in part of your company. Usually every company has some groups that would benefit from it. Usually, sometimes it's R&D, sometimes it's a new product development, sometimes it's a fast growing product within them. But I really encourage companies not to put it out on everyone, because it never goes well. I would say that almost nobody comes to me and says, "Hey, Christina, we read your book and we're going to try it." They come to me and say, "Christina, I read your book and we've been doing it completely wrong and it's a mess and it's a disaster and nobody wants to do OKRs anymore." And so,
same with Agile. Same with Agile.
Yeah, exactly. So at which point we have to talk about, and they've always done the same thing. They've always tried to do it for the whole company. So pilots. I always want to start with their high-performing teams. They always want to start with a bad team. They're like, "Oh, OKRs, we'll fix them." And I'm like, nope. We're going to take somebody who's already really good, who really understands the company, who exemplifies what you're all about, and we're going to start off with them. We're going to explain it to them, and they're usually very excited to try it out, because the good teams always are looking for ways to be better. And they're the ones who will start noticing where it doesn't fit into the culture, it doesn't fit in the timeline. So they become the team that figures out how to take the best practices and turn them into something the company can actually use. I usually have to help them not pre-edit too much, because sometimes people get this sense of doom and they're like, that won't work. And I'm like, let's just try it. Just try it for a couple weeks. We can reconsider, try it for this, quarter. We'll see where it takes us. And at that point, you usually have a good sense of what's going to work and what's not going to work. And then you roll it out really slowly. And we always start with multidisciplinary product teams, the nimble teams. But because there's a lot of teams that just should never get it. It's ridiculous. I was talking to one company, and they had a 2-person team that was people management. And they're like, "We have no idea what our OKRs are." And I was like, "That's because you don't own any of your time. You're running around like crazy people trying to stay on top of everything. You should not do OKRs. It will just make you sad because you'll never be able to achieve it." And I think that's one of the big dangers that people don't think about, is some groups just are going to be depressed by trying OKRs and failing. And so a slower rollout will help you understand OKRs, and then you yourselves can get smarter about who should use them and who shouldn't. You don't want me to be hanging out forever, which I can't anyway. I've got classes to teach. So I always go in thinking, how can I get out of there as fast as possible? And the answer is you've got to understand what OKRs mean for you.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Now, what you mentioned earlier, and I made a note for myself, because when I talk about self-organization or self-management, which is very close, it's one of the prerequisites or one of the outcomes also of hopefully most Agile frameworks, I always say that self-management, self-organization requires certain constraints. Because if there are no constraints, you'll end up with chaos or anarchy. And the teams that do not have any constraints, as you mentioned, they're like, okay, what should we be working on? And constraints can be like defining who your target customer is going to be so that you can build something for them. Constraints can be the strategy that you set out as an organization. You're like, all right, do something that delivers towards the strategy. And what I hear you saying is OKRs help us as leaders and teams collaboratively, and I'd like to also go into this collaboration, define the constraints within which a team can actually self-manage. Is that interpretation correct?
I think so, in that the OKRs will state the most important strategic priority for the company. You work for a company. You can't just run around and do whatever looks fun or interesting or you think is a good idea. Sometimes you can, but not full time, because like you said, it creates chaos and arguments and all sorts of wackiness. No, you bring a team together to do something great for the company. And so the OKR is a way of formulating that strategy. But I also think that if you don't have a strategy, if you're a highly opportunistic company, you can't use OKRs either, because you don't know what to do. I've heard stories, and I'm sure you have too, of somebody who's doing different OKRs every 2 weeks. And I'm like, no, don't even bother. Because that means you have no strategy. And I think more and more I realize very few people have a good model for thinking about strategy. You know, opportunity is great, and all the literature shows that you need a mix of opportunistic behaviors and strategic behaviors, right? You want to be able to take advantage of the pandemic or react quickly. You don't want to hold on to your OKRs when suddenly everything is shutting down. That would be madness, right? Yeah. But on the other hand, you also want to go, okay, this is where we're going in the long run. This is where we want to be in 5-10 years. We want to move into this new market. We want to create this new product for this, target market. You need to have those game plans in place, and you want to keep going forward despite the way life knocks you on your heels, right? So those OKRs are acting that way. They're saying, while you're doing all these cool opportunistic things, let's continue making motion towards these big picture items. And that's what's going to create a healthy, robust, long-term company.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is, in addition to the empowerment, etc., you also need to have an organization that has a strategy, right? You can use Roger Martin's framework of playing to win, like where to play and how to win, or any other frame, but you need to have a strategy in place. Now, I think this is a good segue to the role of leadership, because both having a strategy, having empowered teams, creating alignment, which I also believe OKRs are great for creating alignment if you do have that strategy. What do you consider being like some of the most important thing that leaders can do in organizations that don't have OKRs yet in order to prep the organization to be able to get that vitamin boost and benefit from it?
Absolutely. So I think I'm going to say something a little unexpected, but you need...
Go ahead. I love that.
You need great HR. You need to be able to hire extraordinarily well. It is the most overlooked and absolutely most critical thing you can do. You need those, a combination of A and B players, to be honest. It's like Moneyball, which thank goodness got everybody excited, which is you don't just need A players. You need a combination, a team of all sorts of different people who can bring stability to the group as well as agility to the group. So in this case, a lot of times we just hire a HR person and don't think about it again. And if you're a CEO, if you're a leader, you need someone who really, really understands what you're trying to accomplish, understands the strategy of the company, understands the culture of the company, and can hire terrific people and can enable fast firing. I think Patty McCord did so much good work to make people realize this is critical. And sort of the way growth hacking reinvented marketing, I think HR is definitely the next one that's going to be reinvented because people are everything. And if you have the wrong people, you can't use OKRs either. So as a manager, you have to ask yourself, do I have the kind of people who are going to let me do extraordinary things? And I'm working with some people in areas where hiring is really, really hard. And that's the other thing is if you can't, I'm lucky, I'm in the Silicon Valley. When I was in industry, I could hire an amazing person. You just had to find them, just had to talk to enough people to find that person. But if you're somewhere where you don't have such a good market, you're going to have to start learning how to grow people, right? You've got somebody with a lot of potential, but they have bad habits. You have to learn how to have conversations about conflict and let them know why their behavior is not serving them and help them get stronger. You have to be able to do fit and move somebody into a job where they're going to be successful. You have to demote them if you've made a mistake. And these are things people hate to do. They hate to do this because it's conflict and it's scary and it's emotional, but it's the thing that's going to let you have a company capable of doing great things. So I would say that it's really critical as a leader, both for you to get good at interpersonal dynamics and get really good at management, and then make sure every single one of your managers is good at it too. And they should be able to create psychological safety. They should be able to empower people. They should be able to coach their people. I just heard a wonderful interview with Adam Grant and the CEO of Microsoft, and he was like, it's about the managers. They have to care. You have to feel cared for. You have to coach people. You have to grow them. And I think we're entering an age where we're going to realize that we're not just holding on till AI shows up. And trust me, I'm at Stanford. It's not quite there yet. And we have to learn how to be grown-up people and manage people.
Yeah, I like that point. I mean, when I was preparing for this interview, initially I thought OKR, this is going to be a very technical, not like coding technical, but business technical topic. Very, very focused on metrics and how do you define good OKRs, etc. But the more I read your work, the more I spent time listening to interviews that you gave, I already came across this concept of human interaction.
Yeah.
I didn't phrase it this way. You did it right at the beginning of our conversation today. And what you just mentioned, everything in the role of leadership is create the environment for this human interaction to become better, right?
Yeah.
Help people to learn how to deal with conflict. And in your book or in one of the interviews, you mentioned your not love, but how you also like Patrick Lencioni's work of the 5 dysfunctions of a team, right? And you took some, I think, inspiration from him writing that fable. And in his book, it's all about this human interaction. If you look at the 5 different levels of that pyramid, it's all about like psychological safety or trust in his case, then dealing with conflict, being able to do commitments, holding people accountable. This is human interaction, and ultimately collectively achieving results. And this becomes the work of the manager first and foremost. And once they hire great people, the people chip in, right? They support that journey of a team that then hopefully manages itself. Now, you mentioned earlier one particular symptom of organizations that implement OKRs but are not ready for it yet. And that was frustration and voicing basically, hey, Christina, we've tried it. It doesn't work. What other symptoms, and this is now the medical doctor in me speaking, what other symptoms do you see in organizations that are not ready for OKRs, but they desperately try to do it?
So a classic one is mixing up output thinking and outcome thinking. So a lot of people, even before that, a lot of people don't even know what their metrics are, which I was shocked by because I've been in Silicon Valley for so long. But the rest of the world, like they do things and they make enough money, but they don't always know what works and why it works and how it works. And you mentioned earlier about OKRs being powerful for learning, and I definitely believe that. So people will be like, okay, here's our OKRs, what's going wrong? And it says, objective, which is usually fine, sometimes a little grim. But the KRs are like, launch this thing and do this thing and talk to this person. And I'm like, no, that's your task list. That's your to-do list. So I have to talk them through this way of thinking, which is, if it went as well as you hoped, what would this thing do? What are the signs out there in the world that you were being effective? And so changing to more of a metrics way of thinking is really important. And I don't think that the human side and the number side are at war. In fact, I think they work beautifully together. So if you want to make something inspiring happening, how would you even know if you were successful? How do you know what actually works? So often I have to talk to them about instrumenting, Sometimes it's just that they don't have it at all. But other times it comes back to that the leader isn't ready to trust people. So he's still putting stuff in there. That's things that he wants them to do. And sometimes there's just stuff that's almost impossible to measure. And it's going to take a little while to figure it out. Again, things like the people ops people or customer service. People rush in to try to put metrics on customer service. And we get the famous story, which is you had to serve a certain number of people. That's a beautiful metrics. And so the way the call center was dealing with that is they would hang up on people. Look, hi, we've got you. Okay, hang up. Just because that way they could hit the number of calls they needed to get their bonuses. So it's not enough to say, okay, we're going to find numbers for everything. You have to find the right numbers. And that takes time.
Yeah. Or the number of bank accounts that I think one of the US-based banks, Wells Fargo. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Right. That's also a very, very good story.
And the VW
now, when I think about, pardon?
And the VW story where they were asked to make their diesel magically good for the earth. Yeah, that went really well.
Yeah. That's a very sad one. At least with the number of bank accounts, we didn't punish the environment, but with the other one, we did. Yeah.
Indeed.
Now, when I think about OKRs and when I try to explain it to people, you just pointed out something, right? People putting a lot of tasks as key results. And I try to help them by providing a medical analogy. And the objective, for example, could be that my patient is healthy. The key result could be that the blood pressure is in a certain range, right? Just as one metric. There are a ton of other metrics. But then from that, my activity could be that I select the right type of drug to balance the blood pressure, that I convince my patient to be compliant, right?
Good luck.
That I help them change their diet, and that I help them get in more movement, right? But those are not my OKRs. Those are then the tasks.
Absolutely.
But I can measure whether I've achieved that objective based on the blood pressure. Does that analogy work from your perspective?
It works really well because since you have this goal of the lower blood pressure, and let's say you're going to see them in 3 months, because that's a quarter, then you could try different things, right? You could say, oh, well, I'm not moving more. Well, try walking to the store instead of driving. Okay, it's too hot where you live. Okay, what if you do some sit-ups in the evening when it's cooled off? Like, you just have to keep trying things until something sticks. And that is what makes OKR so powerful, is that a team can keep experimenting until they move those numbers. And instead of investing in one strategy that may or may not work. So yeah, it's a huge difference. Usually I don't worry very much about how people form their OKRs, as long as they don't have a million of them. But that one I think is critical, because it frees you up to be successful in your business goals, as opposed to just making stuff.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned the number of OKRs very briefly, like as long as they don't have millions of them. I've heard you advocate very strongly on just having one set of OKRs.
Yep.
And the argument has been, if you have 2 or 3 objectives, and each objective has 3 to 5 key results, suddenly you have to remember 15 things instead of 3 or 4. And you probably have to figure out how you prioritize between these objectives.
Mm-hmm.
Can you share a bit more around that with me? Because this is one of the topics that I see with almost every company having millions of OKRs, if you just exaggerate a bit.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, gosh, there's so many reasons why people have too many OKRs. And usually when I'm working with a company, I have to bring them down bit by bit by bit. So first of all, people think they have to have a top level company-wide OKR that supports absolutely everybody in the company. And that's not necessary, right? You just need the single most important strategic thing for the company. So that's one thing. OKRs aren't something that every single person wants or needs. In fact, when I've told groups that were struggling with OKRs that aren't suited to it, what if you didn't have any? They're like, oh, I'm so relieved. So here is the boss thinking, I'm being so nice, making sure everybody's covered. And it's like, no, actually, some people just want to hold things at a steady state, right? Sometimes people just want to grow slowly. You don't have to do that. So let's get rid of OKRs that are about tons of different people. And then we can get down to the next level, which is you're probably doing lots of things. But what's the most important thing to happen this quarter? You want to think about sequencing, because if you're doing, you have a limited resources. That's true of everybody. Everybody has limited resources, right? Doesn't matter if you have 200 people or 10 people. You don't have enough to do everything. So then you have to ask yourself, are there dependencies? Do I want to work on making sure I have retention right before I start going on an advertising blitz? So those are the natural ways to spread them out. I encourage managers to look across all 4 quarters, even if you're not going to do all your key results, at least kind of know what you want to focus on each quarter. So remember that you have time. The other thing they forget about is all the everyday stuff. Right? Like you still got to call your supplier and do this and work on that. That's all that stuff going on. And it's not going to be covered by the OKRs. The OKRs should be reserved just for the single most strategic thing. Oh my gosh, more and more I'm like, you know what? You don't need OKRs. What you need is product management. You need a bloody roadmap. You need to learn how to track stuff. You need an agile approach. You need a Kanban board. Like you don't need OKRs. That's not what OKRs do. So I think a lot of companies just need to figure out, how do I have a sense of what's going on, how fast it's going, how many resources does it take, just capacity. And I think it's really hard to do OKRs without an understanding of your organizational capacity. So that often fixes things, like all the stuff that should not be there, like, constantly having A players. I've heard that from HR, and I'm like, that's just your mission. Don't worry about it. Like, just make sure everybody's doing that all the time. Because the OKRs are about change, and not everything has to change all the time.
Exactly, especially the daily work that we have to do, as you mentioned, calling suppliers, like participating in RFPs, etc. Now, before we jump to the topic of the learning organization, there's one thing that I've observed, and I think it's primarily in Germany, but maybe you also have seen it in other places. I see a lot of consultants adding additional stuff to the framework of OKRs, like molds, right? I don't even know what that stands for really. And I wanted to, like, as I do have one of the thought leaders in the space today with me, I just wanted to pick your brain around that, right? To what extent do you believe that these additions are helpful versus being harmful?
I'm a big fan of simple as possible and no simpler. So I've just seen that processes like SAFe, which is the process everybody likes to make fun of, at least in my circles. So, you know, but the thing is, so first of all, it's complicated, so you can't remember it. So there's memory problems. Eventually, once you get used to it, it moves from short-term memory to long-term memory, which is great. That's one of the things I love. Well, I'll save that for the learning organization conversation, but I do love that of OKRs. But when you have so much complexity, it's brittle. People don't have the room to use their own brains. They don't have the room to try out different things. It just, oh gosh, I don't know. I think adding a bunch of stuff is adding a bunch of stuff, and maybe you want to make it your own. Or sometimes it's the same problem that you see when people are making a website or an app. You live it and breathe it as a consultant. So of course you're like, oh, and this would be really good, and this would be really good, and this will help people because it really helps me. But the fact is that the people who do OKRs, they're not doing it full time. They're doing a lot of other things. So you want to keep it simple and crisp and leave a lot of room for them to find their own way forward, and just be really firm on the critical stuff. Like I said, outcome thinking. Don't move on that. Having tons and tons of OKRs. Don't move on that. I always say one, just because I can get them down to 2 or 3, and I'm always pleased with that. But one really is good. So just because we consultants think these are great ideas doesn't mean that they're going to fit into our client's life. And it just overwhelms them. And some people just give up. They're like, this is too many things. I need to go lay down now.
Yeah. I love a quote when it comes to consulting, which is, in theory, the difference between practice and theory doesn't seem that big. In practice, it does. So let's leave it with that.
I don't think anybody's been working on OKRs much longer than me. Maybe Ben Lamorte is about the same, And the thing is, I've seen it with big companies and small companies, and it's been stress tested. And the reality is, simpler is better.
Is better, absolutely. And when you think about the origin of OKRs being Intel and then Google making it a bit bigger, but those organizations kept it, as far as I know, very, very simple, especially if you read Andy Grove's work around that topic and then John Doerr. It's great. Now, moving to the final topic, the learning organization. I know, or I've been always connecting agility to, which is for me, empiricism, the scientific process, frequently and systematically reducing uncertainty in terms of your customers, your products, and of course, your organization. And the reduction of uncertainty is always learning, right? Now, you connect OKRs to the learning organization. Walk us through how you do that.
Oh, definitely. No problem. So here's the thing. OKRs, unlike other goal-setting methodologies or systems like SMART goals and KPIs, actually does have a little bit of a methodology around it, right? On Mondays, you say, what are we going to do towards our OKRs? On Friday, we celebrate our wins. It's tiny, but it makes a huge difference. And what's interesting is when I started teaching, I went deeper and deeper into learning science. And so now I have tons of data that, looking back on OKRs, I'm like, this is why they work so well. Oh my gosh. So first of all, at the beginning, you say, okay, we think we can do this. So that's prediction. That's a classic learning technique where you try to predict what's possible and then you find out. And this does make deeper grooves in the neurons, or whatever you want to talk about. It makes you remember it. So you're setting your OKRs, and that's like, okay, this is what we think we can do. Then every single Monday, we're trying things, right? And every next Monday, we're going, okay, this didn't work, but we're going to try this. That's learning. The other thing is, every single week you talk about your OKRs, which means you're moving them from the short-term memory, which can't hold much, to the long-term memory, which actually has, as far as we know, unlimited capacity, because you are reinforcing the paths between the neurons and you're getting the memory deeper and deeper into our head. So in the first month, you're like, I can't remember that third KR. What was it? And by the end, you're like, oh, I just live retention. That's what I do, and I know what numbers matter, and I know why they matter, and I know what I should be doing. And that's what I talk about when I talk about learning, not that moment just of, oh, we tried that and that didn't work, or we tried that, that did work. It's more about, I really understand what makes people be willing to sign up, or I really understand what this market cares about, because you constantly stay within that theme, understanding all the bits and pieces that are around it. And the other thing is that every single Friday is a sort of retrospective, and of course, Agile has retrospectives, which is why I didn't put it in OKRs. I'm like, already, right? But I do like that end of quarter, no matter what, let's stop for a second, look at what we succeeded at, what we failed at, and then make some decisions about that, and then make decisions about how we're going to go forward. And that's really good for learning. In fact, I would say the number one advantage of OKRs is the learning, and the number one competitive strength you need as a company is learning, because things move fast, and we've got to be able to stay on top of it. So that rhythm is everything.
There's this presentation from Gary Hamel where he talks about that knowledge is becoming a commodity. So the only thing that's going to be a competitive advantage is the pace at which you create new knowledge,
Yes.
Right? And I like how you now connected OKRs to the learning organization, because you learn on one dimension, which is you become better at setting OKRs. You become better at making predictions, and having predictability in your business, especially if you're dealing with multiple stakeholders, is always a benefit. It builds trust. It gives you even more empowerment and all of that. But you also mentioned that through the repetition and through the experimentation to get to a certain outcome, you build a deep understanding of, be it your customer needs or a way to get retention and all of that. And I love how that connects really, really well with the learning organization and everything that I've been teaching. Now,
Absolutely.
I want to be mindful of your time, because you've been so gracious with us, sharing your perspectives with us. And I want to close with a quick summary of what we have covered. I've been taking notes while you were speaking. And the first thing you mentioned, and which I believe could be the overall theme of this, is human interaction and how important that is, especially going forward. More and more of the work is going to be done by humans collaborating collectively and building great products and services and delivering those things to their customers. You also mentioned that OKRs should help us understand what we are not doing, but what would be interesting. And in the fable you share here, right, the conversations between Hannah and Jack, Hannah is all about, oh, we should be doing this, we should be doing this, and Jack completely forgets about those things. And by the way, I was rooting for Hannah all the time because I saw so much of me in her, which was fascinating.
Wonderful.
Then you mentioned, which is for me the quote of today as a medical doctor: OKRs are a vitamin, not a medicine. Thank you for that. And all the prerequisites that we need to have in place, and how leadership is really responsible for initially creating the environment for then being able to implement OKRs.
Yes.
And we close with the topic of the learning organization, where OKRs help us through the repetition, but also through really focusing on hitting certain goals and experimenting and getting there. I want to close with another quote from this book. It's also, in this case, from the introduction. Doesn't mean that I haven't read more than that. You know, I've read about Hannah and Jack and all of that.
I'm getting jealous.
But similar to the previous one that I shared, this is for those that are willing to put in the effort to embrace a culture of empowerment. I think you will love this book. It will inspire you and get you started on your journey. And I couldn't have said it better.
Oh.
Really, everyone who wants to embark on this journey, and I believe this is a very powerful framework, and you've put it so nicely together, especially with the fable at the beginning. I just couldn't let the book go out of my hands. I want to thank you for the work that you've done, how you've shared your knowledge with all of us, not being in the Silicon Valley, and how you also shared your time with us today, Christina.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
And I will be in Hamburg at Mind the Product Hamburg. If you want to go deeper, I'll be doing a workshop on OKR. So if this take is interesting to any of your listeners, that would be amazing. And
Absolutely. We will link it below our show notes.
Yeah, definitely. And if anybody wants to reach out for more one-on-one time, I'm open to that as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Christina. All right, everyone, thank you for participating live. Everybody else, you can see this soon online.
Wonderful.
Bye, Christina. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you so much.